everybody. My name is Ann Alexander, and I'm an economist here at the University of Wyoming. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the economic history of Wyoming. Now, that might sound boring because history can sound boring, but you just have to remember that what you're living right now in your day today, people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, were living their day-to-day lives, and we've captured it in sometimes boring formats like screens and books and things like that. But we're going to tell the story of Wyoming's economic history with pictures. And another thing I do want to point out before we start is that because I'm focusing on pictures, I am really going to be zooming in on the European settlement of Wyoming. Admittedly, the Arapaho, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Crow, and several other indigenous peoples that came before us also lived and worked in Wyoming. But I don't have as many pictures of them, so I'm going to focus on the European settlement of Wyoming, which has been very recent in history. So that's what we're going to start. Now, I call this talk Living the Code of the West because it focuses on where we worked and where we lived. And just if you're not familiar with the Code of the West, this slide is about that. And it basically talks about how we try to treat each other in the West. So living each day with courage, all the way down to when you make a promise, keep it. The people that lived here in times past lived this code. And they had to because it's kind of rough to live here. Right now, as I'm speaking outside, it's about -10 degrees and there's a lot of wind. So you had to be kind and trustworthy to live here. So let's dive a little bit into how Wyoming got its European settlers and how they ended up configuring their work lives. So when you talk about the history of economic expansion in Wyoming, you can't talk about it without talking about two very important things. One is the Transcontinental Railroad, and the other is cattle. Now, those are not the things that drive our economy today, but without them, European settlement would not have occurred in Wyoming. Throughout the 18th century and 19th century, quite a few people crossed Wyoming who were of European descent. But they did not stay here, primarily because agriculture was really hard and our transportation networks were really bad. So only a tiny fraction stayed. You might have heard of the famous mountain men and the voyageurs, right? So those folks stayed here, but there was a very small number. Most people were headed somewhere else, like Oregon or California. But during the Civil War, when the Pacific Railway Act was signed by President Lincoln, that changed the calculus of what could happen in Wyoming. We now had a connection. Previous to this, railroads were following settlement patterns, right? They came about to help serve an existing population. And the eastern part of the United States was very disconnected from the West and the Midwest. But the Transcontinental Railroad really changed that calculus. And what that did was it basically allowed for a settlement that occurred in a different way than it had back east or in any other place. And it basically allowed for the prairies and the plains to become settled after the construction. It preceded the influx of European settlement, though, and that's what makes it very unique. As our first governor actually said, John Campbell, he said for the first time in the history of our country, the organization of a territorial government was rendered necessary by the building of a railroad. Heretofore, the railroad has been a follower instead of the pioneer of civilization. So this was a unique situation in history. The railroad really shaped a lot of Wyoming's settlement patterns in the early days. The Union Pacific Railroad, which was established to build the Transcontinental Railroad, ended up with some very large land grants from the federal government, meaning they were given land to offset the capital costs of construction. And so that meant that a large part of southern Wyoming, where the Transcontinental Railroad was built, was owned in a checkerboard pattern by the Union Pacific Railroad. And that blocked large settlement tracts, but it did bring in quite a few people. As a result, what you ended up seeing in the first sort of wave of European settlement was that most everybody that was coming from Ohio or New York or Pennsylvania ended up settling in the southern tier counties of Wyoming. So by the 1880s, you ended up with about 80% of the population living in southern Wyoming. This allowed the Transcontinental Railroad allowed more European immigrants to come in and settle. And the railroad opened up trade to distant markets. So that's why all of a sudden the calculus of everything changed. Prior to that, you had to go by horse or wagon, and you had to make your way first to St. Louis and then maybe back east. Sometimes you had to take rivers as well. This was a different mode of transportation that really revolutionized the way people could settle in Wyoming. At first, the Union Pacific was one of the largest private landholders and largest employers in Wyoming. And that actually remained the same for several decades. There's a lovely picture of the UP machine shops here in Laramie, which is where we're at here at the University of Wyoming. Some more pictures. This one is from Cheyenne. And what you'll notice about where our towns are situated is that that was also dictated by the railroads. The railroads had coal-powered engines, and every so often they had to have a place where they could refill water to cool down the engines. And so our major towns across the southern part of the state, Cheyenne, Laramie, Rawlins, Green River, and Rock Springs, are all situated in exactly the right spot for a coal-powered railroad engine to get to the next place and get some more water. So the way we worked, basically very much dictated in the early days by the Union Pacific. One thing that's really interesting to know is that in the 1870s, after the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, they had to go back and rip some of it back up because they didn't use very good steel. So they had to replace the soft iron and generate additionally strengthened steel for the tracks to last. So it established what's called a rolling mill in Laramie, and that was the largest manufacturing facility in Wyoming until 1910 when it burned down. You can still see the ruins of it outside of town. The next piece of really influential economic history to talk about is the cattle kingdom. You've probably heard a little bit about this. This is part of the legend of the West, right? And how did that even come to be? Well, in the late 18th century, large herds of cattle that had been brought over by the Spanish conquistadors and then let loose had kind of interbred with domestic cattle, particularly in Texas. And those came to be what we now know as the Texas Longhorn. They're not very good to eat, but they can survive a lot of really hard conditions. They were cheap too because nobody owned them, right? They were free and wild and basically for sale to anybody. So you could buy cattle in Texas for very cheap, take them somewhere, fatten them up, and then take them back east and sell them for a killing because in the eastern part of the United States, wealth was starting to become greater and greater. And as a country gets richer, they eat more meat. So there were these largely unowned herds of Texas Longhorns just roaming around. And capitalists being what capitalists are, they saw an opportunity because of U.S. urban growth. You could buy a Longhorn in Texas for $3 to $4 a head and then sell it out east for about $40 a head. And that's back in 1874. That's a lot of money now. Now, one of the things that they discovered because these Longhorns were so hardy was that they could take them up to the Northern Plains, which is where Wyoming is, and they could fatten them up here. So here's a picture of a cattle drive that you might have, those are very famous, you might have seen pictures of or depictions of in paintings. And in this case, this is a large herd of cattle being driven from the south to the north to fatten up in the north of Wyoming. And so there's one of the other epic things that you often see, which is the food wagon that had to accompany all these cowboys and these huge herds of cows. The other thing about Wyoming was that we had open range. We had a bunch of unowned land in the northern part of the state. Now remember, the southern part of the state is mostly owned by the Union Pacific, but the northern part of the state, which is where the really good grazing land is, is completely unowned and open to homesteaders. And so what we ended up seeing was that the meat demand is rising out east. The venture capitalists from out east, as well as in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom, would give a bunch of money to a ranch operation. They would then go procure cows and bring them up to Wyoming where they could just graze wherever they wanted. So there's another picture of a cattle herding operation. So the railroad, again, I've already said this, but I'm just going to put it into words here. The railroad had pretty much blocked off large tracts of settlement land opportunities in the southern part of the state. It's also pretty dry down here, so we don't have the beautiful lush fields of the northern part of the state. So Sheridan and places like that. You can see that you have to pump a lot of water out by this windmill just to get water out of the land. So let alone having large tracts of cows. So that started this long-standing north-south split in the state. The south is pretty much settled for the railroad, and the northern part of the state was for the cattle. Now, that is an extremely attenuated and short version of how Wyoming got to be what it is. But we are not all a bunch of cowboys, and we are not all a bunch of railroaders anymore. But those two things set the basis for the settlement of Wyoming. And our economy has changed and morphed and grown over the years. But where we've worked has been very much dictated by the elements and by the fact that wherever you end up having to set up a coal mine or a ranching operation or something like that, you have to have things like dentists and doctors and teachers come along to help support the population that's starting to bloom. We've also had a lot of booms and busts in our history, and that's because we have things like oil. We have a lot of oil in Wyoming, right? So there's a picture of some poor gentleman who just discovered a great big oil well, and now they're covered in oil, but they're probably pretty happy because now they're rich. We also mine other things that you may not think of as typically mined kinds of things. So for example, this is a picture of a soda block. Soda ash is used for everything from kitty litter to, well, just everything. There's a lot of soda ash and a lot of things. And they often call us the Saudi Arabia of soda ash. So didn't know that, did you? And there's a big giant block to show you how big these things go. This is just a fun picture of a coal miner, a very brave coal miner who is walking across a guide wire on his way to fix something, probably on the way into the mine entrance. Most mining in Wyoming, by the way, when it comes to coal, is surface mining. They don't have to go far down into tunnels. This is a picture of a mine rescue training center. So with every coal mine, there come possible explosions and problems. So you need to have rescue squads. Here are some gentlemen that are working on a piston and cable that is also for a coal mine. So you can see that there's a very large manufacturing bed that's starting to emerge in Wyoming when it comes to the railroad as well as when it comes to mining. And here's a more modern day version of mining. We still do mining here in Wyoming, coal mining, soda ash, trona, all sorts of kinds of mining, oil and gas. And this is a more recent picture from 2017 of an integrated test center in Gillette, Wyoming. But as I said, you can't just have a bunch of miners and a bunch of cattle barons and a bunch of railroaders. They need towns. They need services. They need people to, look at their teeth. So we also started to see the growth of some of our more permanent settlements. Here's a picture of Rawlins from 1920. Here's the druggist in a town called Encampment, which is not far from Laramie. It's over the other side of the Snowy Range, and this is from 1900. Here you see a picture of Torrington, another town that began to emerge that actually capitalizes on agriculture and is a very large agricultural center in Wyoming. This is a picture of another very important industry in Wyoming still to this day, which is sheep herding. We actually had quite a large number of sheep herders who immigrated from the Basque country. And so the Basque traditions are alive and well in the northern part of the state. But of course, sheep and cattle don't always get along. So there's a whole other story there that you can look up someday called the Johnson County War. This is a picture of something else that started to emerge as the 20th century turned, which is the Dude Ranch. So this was a big business to allow the folks out east who never had been a cattle rancher or never been a cowboy to get to experience a little tiny bit of what that was like. Probably not nearly as hard as what a cowboy has to do, but nevertheless. Where did we work? Well, we worked out in the elements, such as in this example. You can see this is a sheep shearing fiesta that's going on here, where all of the sheep herders in a particular region have brought all of their sheep into one place, and now they have to shear them. This is a picture of another one of our big industries in Wyoming, which is sugar beet farming. We actually had a very large influx of Japanese immigrants that came here, as well as immigrants from the Volga-Deutsch region of Russia, that brought with them the idea that the climate here would be very suitable to beet farming, and they did that. And it's still quite an industry today. Here's another picture of cowboys at the Pitchfork Ranch in a town called Meeteetse. Here is another picture of ranchers. This time I wanted to emphasize that ranch work is not just men's work. Women were ranch owners and cowgirls. So these two women right here demonstrate that in this picture. This is a picture of the construction of one of our dams in the state. So this is up in the northern part of the state near a town called Cody, near Yellowstone. This is a picture of an immigrant worker in the beet harvest in Torrington. And this is the construction of the hospital in Rock Springs. Another thing you need if you have people around is a hospital. This hospital was constructed in 1893. Where else did we work? Well, here's another sheep wagon picture. And this is a logging picture. Near Laramie, just outside of town, there was a very large logging industry as well. It's much smaller now, but it's still active. This is a picture of a local store from 1926. And so you can see that this is where people came to get some of their conveniences when they stopped having to make all of their own things. Another thing that you saw very, very prominently in the early days of Wyoming is that we had a lot of newspapers that were established very quickly. So this is a picture of the Laramie Boomerang staff in 1926. Again, we still have the Laramie Boomerang, still a newspaper in town. So there are some people working there. This is the Cheyenne Tribune and their staff. This is from the 1950s. Teachers, of course, very important when you're trying to settle a land. And so here's a lovely picture of some teachers from Platte County, which is one of our eastern counties. Here is Harriet Byrd, who ended up being one of our first African-American legislators in the state, and she was a teacher. So this is a picture of her with her students. This is a picture of some of our female faculty members at the University of Wyoming from 1896. We are called the Equality State. Wyoming is called the Equality State for a reason, because women had equal suffrage here. They could own property, they could vote, and they could have professions. And so this is a picture of our professional female faculty members at the university in the late 1800s. This is a picture of our female militia cadets here at the University of Wyoming. We have a thing called the Reserve Officer Training Corps that still is here to this day. And as part of our mission as a land grant institution that the federal government requires us to do, we have to train militias, right? So the Reserve Officer Training Corps, in this case, this picture is showing the women in the Reserve Officer Training Corps from the same time period. These are some more recent pictures just to show you that we've become, we're still here. We maybe don't teach exactly the same things, but this is a picture of our visualization center, our vertical dance performance, which is something very extraordinary that you should see someday, and of our Independence Day celebration here at the University of Wyoming. This is a picture of the Sheridan Iron Works. So again, back to the manufacturing concept, you can see this, and this is from 1925. But we still do manufacturing. This is a picture from 2021. This is a place called Double D Welding and Fabrication. They do a lot of 3D work as well as welding. Here's a picture of our Casper Police Department in 1926. Of course, very important to have some form of law and order, and we still have those folks, but they look a little different now and they do things differently. Here's a picture of the Casper Police Department in 2017 with a drone. And then on the other side there, you can see our Albany County Sheriff's Department, where you can see they're using snowmobiles and four-wheelers, and there are women and men of all different kinds of ethnicities and races serving in our law enforcement agencies. This is a picture of Thyra Thompson, who was our Secretary of State, one of the first female elected politicians in the country, and she's looking at a picture of Esther Hobart Morris, who was the first female voter in the United States in Wyoming. This is a picture of Chinese miners from Rock Springs who are visiting several years, 40 years after they worked in the Rock Springs mines, and this picture's from 1926. This is another sheep shearing person, but she's very pretty and she has a lot of wool, so she looks like she's been working very hard. This is just a funny picture because everybody needs to see this picture. This is Jacob Schwab, who is a businessman up in the northern part of the state, and he is in a parade and he's riding a tiny little carriage that's being pulled by a sheep. It's pretty funny. I like that picture. These are migrant worker children at the beet harvest. And this is probably in the eastern part of the state. Yes, it is. Here is a woman who's serving in the Spruce Mountain Fire Lookout in the Medicine Bow National Forest. That is right here, not far from us. And she is serving as a fire lookout to see and spot any forest fires. And this is just fun. It's a trick rider, a female trick rider at one of our rodeos. And this is from Cheyenne Frontier Days in 1920. But today we still work together and we may look a little bit different, but this is still the basic good place of Wyoming, where we are trustworthy, we are kind to each other, and we watch out for each other. As you can see in these pictures, we still live the code of the West. So with that, I will leave you and hope that you will have your interest in the state of Wyoming piqued by hearing this and other videos in this series. Thank you very much.